So I'm 23, I'm from the UK, I run a faceless YouTube channel called Wi-Fi Uni with 25,000 subscribers, and it makes me around $2,000 a month. And today I want to talk about something that I think is genuinely one of the most useful things I can share, which is why most people who start a YouTube channel fail in the first 90 days. Because I've thought about this a lot. I've watched it happen to people I know, and I came pretty close to being one of those people myself. And I think understanding exactly why it happens is the thing that gives you the best chance of not letting it happen to you. Please excuse this AI slop voice. I promise the value in this video is worth it. And before I get into the reasons, I want to set some context because I think the 90-day figure is actually quite important and not arbitrary. And the reason most people fail, specifically in that window rather than later, is that 90 days is long enough for the initial excitement to have completely worn off, but not long enough for the compounding to have started showing up in the numbers. And that gap between losing the excitement and gaining the evidence that it's working is where almost everyone quits. And the people who make it through that gap are the ones who end up building something real. So the first reason, and I think this is the most common one, is that people start with the wrong expectation about what the first 90 days is actually for. And what I mean by that is most people starting a YouTube channel have some version of the belief that if they make good content, the views will come. Like quality will be recognized and rewarded relatively quickly. And when that doesn't happen, they conclude that either the content isn't good enough, or the platform doesn't work, or the niche is wrong, and they quit or pivot before they've given it enough time to actually develop. But the first 90 days isn't really about getting views, and it's not really about building an audience, and it's definitely not about making money. And what it's actually about is two things. First, building the habit and the workflow of making and posting content consistently. And second, giving YouTube enough data about your channel to start understanding what it is and who it's for. And neither of those things produces visible results in 90 days. They're just groundwork. And if you go in expecting visible results and you don't get them, you'll quit. And if you go in knowing that visible results aren't the point yet, you'll keep going. I didn't fully understand this when I started Wi-Fi Uni, and there were weeks in the first 3 months where I genuinely considered whether it was worth continuing. Because I was posting every other day, and the videos were getting 60, 70, 80 views, and the subscriber count was barely moving. And every time I opened the analytics, it looked like nothing was happening. And the honest feeling in those moments was that maybe I was just wasting my time. What kept me going was less some deep strategic understanding and more just stubbornness. Like, I'd committed to giving it 6 months, and I wasn't going to quit before that. And I think that stubbornness was more valuable than any piece of advice I could have had at the time. Because the strategic understanding came later, but the stubbornness got me through the period where I needed it. The second reason is comparison. And I think this one is more insidious than people realize, because it operates quietly in the background, and it's hard to recognize it as the problem. What happens is you start your channel, you're posting consistently, and you're also watching other channels in your niche, some of which are bigger, some of which are growing faster, and without really meaning to, you start comparing your results to theirs. And that comparison is almost always unfair, because you're comparing your month 1 to their year 2, or you're comparing your behind-the-scenes reality to their highlight reel, or you're comparing a channel in a slightly different niche with different conditions to your own. And none of those comparisons are useful, but they all feel relevant when you're in the middle of it. I did this a lot in the first 90 days. Like, I'd watch a channel in the AI niche that was clearly growing faster than mine, and I'd try to figure out what they were doing that I wasn't. And sometimes that was useful because I'd spot something about their thumbnails or their titles that I could apply, but mostly it just made me feel like I was behind. And feeling behind makes it harder to show up consistently because there's this voice in the background saying it might already be too late, or you might just not have what it takes. The fix for this is actually pretty simple, which is just to stop watching your competitors obsessively and focus on whether you're better at making videos this week than you were last week, because that's the only comparison that's actually useful. And if the answer is yes, then you're on the right track, regardless of what anyone else's channel is doing. The third reason is inconsistency. And this one is probably the most straightforward, but it's worth saying clearly because I think people underestimate how much it matters. YouTube is trying to build a picture of your channel, and it does that by looking at patterns, like what topics does this channel cover, who watches it, how long do they watch for, and how often does it post. And if you're posting inconsistently, 3 videos one week, and then nothing for 2 weeks, and then 1 video, and then a gap, the algorithm has a much harder time building that picture. And what this means in practice is that the early phase takes longer, the channel takes longer to get categorized, and the compounding takes longer to start. And there's also a skills element to this that I think people miss, which is that making videos is a skill. And like any skill, it improves with repetition. And if you're posting inconsistently, you're not getting the repetitions in fast enough for the skill to develop at the rate it needs to. Like the person posting every other day is getting 3 times as many repetitions as the person posting twice a week. And over 90 days, that compounds into a significant gap in ability that shows up in the quality of the content and how it performs. I posted every other day from the start, and I think the consistency of it was one of the main reasons the channel got to where it got to. Not because any individual video was exceptional, but because the volume of consistent posting gave YouTube what it needed to understand the channel, and gave me what I needed to get better at making the content. The 4th reason is over-optimizing too early. And this is one I see a lot, and it's a bit counterintuitive because it looks like the person is doing everything right. What happens is, someone starts a channel, they read everything they can about YouTube growth, they study thumbnails and titles and SEO and retention analytics, and they apply all of that knowledge before they've even figured out the basics of making a decent video. And the result is a channel where a huge amount of energy is going into the optimization layer, while the content itself is still finding its feet. And that's basically the wrong order. The first 90 days should be almost entirely focused on making content and getting better at making content. And the optimization stuff should come in gradually as you start to understand what's actually working and what isn't. Because optimizing something that isn't working yet is just optimizing nothing. And the energy spent on it is energy that could have gone into making another video. I made this mistake a bit in the early months. Like, I spent more time than I should have thinking about titles and thumbnails, when the bigger issue was just that the content itself wasn't clear enough or structured well enough to hold people's attention. And fixing the content moved the needle way more than any amount of thumbnail optimization would have. The 5th reason, and I think this is the one that doesn't get talked about enough, is that people don't have a clear enough answer to the question of why they're doing it. And that sounds a bit philosophical, but I think it's actually really practical, because the first 90 days is going to test your reason for doing it multiple times. And if the reason isn't solid, the test will win. If the reason is, I want to make loads of money quickly, that reason gets destroyed by the first 90 days because there's no money in the first 90 days. And so you quit because the thing you were doing it for isn't happening. If the reason is, I want to build something that compounds over time and gives me income and flexibility that a normal job can't, that reason survives the first 90 days because the first 90 days is just the beginning of building that thing. And not getting views yet doesn't contradict the reason. It's just the early part of the process. My reason was pretty simple. I wanted to build something that I owned, something that would compound and grow and eventually give me income that wasn't tied to a salary or a boss or someone else's business. And that reason held up through the early months because nothing that happened in those months contradicted it. Like, yes, the views were low, but that was just the early phase of building the thing I wanted to build. And that framing made it much easier to keep going. So to pull it all together, people fail in the first 90 days because they go in with the wrong expectation about what that period is for, because they compare themselves to channels in completely different stages, because they post inconsistently and slow down their own development, because they optimize the wrong things at the wrong time, and because their reason for doing it isn't strong enough to survive the inevitable period where nothing seems to be working. And the solution to all of those things is just understanding what the first 90 days actually is, which is groundwork. It's the period where you're building the habit, developing the skill, giving the algorithm the data it needs, and laying the foundation that everything else gets built on. And none of that is visible in the numbers while it's happening. It only shows up later. And the people who understand that are the people who make it through. I nearly didn't make it through. And I think about that sometimes. Like, if I'd quit at month 2 because the numbers weren't moving, I'd have quit right before things started to change. And that's probably true for a lot of people who stop just short of the point where it starts to compound. If you want more direct help building something like this, I do have a school community linked in the description. There's one-to-one feedback available depending on which tier you join. No pressure at all. Cheers for watching.